Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For more than 2 decades, when Americans heard the word terrorism, they usually thought of one thing: September 11th. They thought of airplanes hitting the World Trade Center, the Pentagon attack, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the long global fight against Islamist terrorism. After September 11th, the United States completely rebuilt its national security system. The government created new intelligence networks, expanded counterterrorism operations, and worked with allies around the world to prevent another major attack on American soil. But now, more than 20 years later, Washington is debating a new question. Has America's biggest security challenge changed? Are the threats of tomorrow coming mainly from foreign terrorist organizations? Or are political extremism and domestic radicalization becoming a new battlefield inside Western democracies? That debate came into the spotlight last week, when Secretary of State Marco Rubio hosted an international meeting focused on what he described as the revival of political terrorism. Rubio argued that for many years, Western countries focused almost exclusively on Islamist terrorism while ignoring another form of political violence, extremist movements on the left. His speech immediately triggered controversy. Supporters say Rubio is simply demanding that all forms of political violence receive equal attention. Critics argue that the government risks turning political disagreement into a national security issue. So what exactly is happening? Is America really facing a new wave of political terrorism? Or is this another chapter in America's growing culture war? Today, we will take a closer look. After the attacks of the 11th of September 2001, America's understanding of terrorism changed forever. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes and killed nearly 3,000 people. The attack shocked the United States and transformed national security priorities. For the next 2 decades, American counterterrorism policy was largely built around one central mission: prevent another 9/11. The United States launched military operations overseas, dismantled terrorist networks, and created a global intelligence partnership involving dozens of countries. American forces eventually killed Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. Later, the U.S. and its allies destroyed much of ISIS's territorial control in Iraq and Syria. Rubio argued that this strategy achieved significant results. According to him, Islamist terrorism has been greatly reduced compared with its peak years. The number of major attacks has declined, ISIS lost its so-called caliphate, and international cooperation made it much harder for terrorist organizations to operate openly. But Rubio's argument is that the world has changed. The threat America faces today is not identical to the threat it faced after 9/11. And according to him, governments must recognize a broader range of political violence. At the center of Rubio's argument is a simple idea: terrorism should be judged by actions, not political labels. He argues that for many years, Western societies were willing to recognize some forms of extremism while being reluctant to discuss others. According to Rubio, violence committed by certain ideological movements was sometimes treated as a political issue rather than a security threat. He specifically criticized what he described as radical left-wing terrorism. In his speech, Rubio pointed to historical examples of violent left-wing organizations in Europe and the United States. He mentioned groups such as Germany's Red Army faction, Latin American revolutionary organizations, and American groups like the Weather Underground. These groups were responsible for bombings, kidnappings, assassinations, and attacks during different periods of the 20th century. Rubio's message was clear: political violence does not belong to only one side of the ideological spectrum. If a movement uses violence to achieve political goals, governments should treat it as a security threat regardless of whether it comes from the left or the right. But this is where the debate becomes complicated, because in America, the question is not only about terrorism, it is also about politics. The United States has always struggled with the balance between national security and individual freedom. During the Cold War, the government investigated communist organizations and suspected sympathizers. After 9/11, the government expanded surveillance powers in the name of fighting terrorism. Each time, Americans debated the same question: how do you protect society from dangerous movements without punishing legal political expression? This concern is especially important today because the definition of extremism can become politically controversial. One person's radical idea may be another person's political belief. A protest movement for one group may look like dangerous disruption to another group, a government trying to stop violence must be careful not to confuse unpopular opinions with criminal actions. Supporters of Rubio's position argue that this distinction is exactly why his approach is necessary. They say America should not repeat past mistakes by ignoring threats simply because they come from a politically uncomfortable direction. Their argument is, violence is violence. If someone attacks people, destroys infrastructure, or plans terrorist activity, their ideology should not protect them from investigation. They point out that democratic societies cannot survive if political groups believe violence is an acceptable way to achieve their goals. From this perspective, the government's responsibility is not to protect one political side. It is to protect citizens from all forms of political violence. However, critics have raised serious questions. They argue that the phrase left-wing extremism can be used too broadly. They worry that government officials may label aggressive political speech, protests, or unpopular opinions as security threats. They also argue that the United States has experienced serious violence from multiple ideological movements, including far-right extremist groups. Their concern is that focusing too much on one category of extremism could create a distorted picture of the actual threat. In their view, the government should rely on evidence of criminal behavior, not ideology. The key question is not, what political beliefs does someone have? The key question is, are they planning or committing violence? But beyond the debate over definitions, there is a bigger question. Why is this issue becoming more important in Washington right now? The answer may have less to do with terrorism alone and more to do with the changing nature of American politics. Over the past decade, political divisions in the United States have become deeper than at any point in recent history. Republicans and Democrats increasingly view each other not simply as political opponents, but as threats to the future direction of the country. That environment creates a dangerous possibility. When people begin to believe that the other side is not just wrong, but evil, political conflict can become much more extreme. And history shows that political violence often grows in societies where compromise disappears. This is one reason why Rubio and other conservatives argue that America needs a new approach. They believe the government's traditional counterterrorism framework was designed mainly to fight foreign organizations, but today's extremist movements operate differently. They may not have a clear headquarters. They may not control territory. They may communicate through encrypted platforms, social media networks, and decentralized communities. Supporters of Rubio's argument say that modern extremist groups can recruit, organize, and spread propaganda without looking like traditional terrorist organizations. A person does not need to belong to a formal organization to participate in political violence, and because of the internet, a small group of extremists can potentially have a much larger impact. Rubio also emphasized the international dimension. He argued that modern extremist networks are increasingly connected across borders. According to his speech, these groups can use online communication systems, international fundraising networks, foreign connections, shared propaganda channels. His argument is that governments cannot fight these movements individually. They need cooperation between intelligence agencies, law enforcement organizations, and international partners. In other words, Rubio wants political extremism to be treated more like a traditional counterterrorism challenge, not simply as a domestic political issue. But this raises another important question. Is political extremism actually increasing? Or are political leaders simply paying more attention to it because it is useful in the current political environment? This is where the debate becomes much more complicated, because statistics about political violence can be interpreted in different ways. One side may focus on the number of attacks. Another side may focus on the political motivation behind those attacks. Some groups may commit fewer attacks but receive more attention because of their symbolism. Other threats may be more common but receive less political attention. So the challenge for policymakers is not only identifying threats, it is also deciding how to measure them fairly. The debate over Antifa is a good example of this conflict. For many conservatives, Antifa represents a dangerous extremist movement that uses violence and intimidation to silence political opponents. They argue that some individuals associated with Antifa have participated in violent confrontations and should be treated as a security concern. However, Many liberals and civil rights groups argue that Antifa is not a centralized organization like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They argue that the label has sometimes been used too broadly to describe a variety of activists, some of whom are involved only in political protest. This disagreement reflects a larger American debate. When does radical political activism become extremism? When does extremism become terrorism? And who gets to decide? These questions are not easy. A democracy depends on allowing people to express strong political opinions. Many important movements in American history were once considered radical. The civil rights movement, the labor movement, and anti-war movements all challenged existing systems. Political change often begins with people who are dissatisfied with the status quo. But democracy also depends on rejecting violence. A society cannot function if political movements believe they have the right to use threats or force against opponents. The difficult balance is protecting free expression while preventing violence. This is why America's new terrorism debate is so significant. It is not only about security, it is also about the future of democracy. The United States has always struggled with political extremism. During the 20th century, America faced threats from revolutionary groups, racial extremists, foreign intelligence operations, and political assassins. The challenge today is different. The country is not facing one single enemy. Instead, it is dealing with a highly divided society where different groups increasingly distrust each other. So what does Rubio's speech really represent? At one level, it represents a shift in how some policymakers define national security. For decades, terrorism was often viewed as something coming from outside America. Now, more officials are focusing on threats developing within the country itself. At another level, it represents a major political battle over language. The words we use matter. Calling a movement terrorism is not just a description. It gives the government greater authority and changes how society responds. That is why these debates become so intense. Supporters of Rubio's approach believe America cannot afford to ignore political violence. They argue that pretending certain threats do not exist will only make the country less safe. Their message is simple. A democracy must defend itself against anyone who uses violence to destroy it. It does not matter whether the extremists come from the far left, the far right, or any other ideology. Critics respond with a different warning. They argue that fighting extremism requires precision. If the government expands the definition too far, it risks turning political disagreement into a security issue. A free society must be careful not to create a system where government power can be used against lawful opposition. In their view, the solution is not broader political labels. The solution is focusing on specific crimes and clear evidence. So where does this leave America? Perhaps the biggest challenge is not choosing between fighting terrorism and protecting freedom. A successful democracy must do both. America needs the ability to identify genuine threats, but it also needs the humility to recognize that political opponents are not automatically enemies. The history of the United States shows that democracy survives not because Americans always agree. They survive because disagreement can happen without violence. The next chapter of America's security debate may not be fought on foreign battlefields. It may be fought inside American communities, online spaces, and political institutions. The question facing the country is not only, who is the enemy? The deeper question is, how can a divided democracy defend itself from extremism without losing the freedoms it is trying to protect? Because the greatest test of a democracy is not whether it can defeat its enemies. The greatest test is whether it can protect itself while remaining a democracy. Thank you for watching. If you think political violence is becoming a serious threat in America, or if you believe the government must be careful not to overreach, share your thoughts in the comments. This debate is not going away, and it may shape the future of American politics for years to come.